In this video, I'm going to go ahead and put together a sample application that we can use to talk about how fragments interact with action bars. Now, it turns out that fragments interact with action bars in a pretty straightforward manner, and it won't take very long to discuss it. However, creating a sample application involving fragments so I can demonstrate that behavior, I think is kind of an interesting thing, especially for people who haven't worked a lot with fragments or maybe haven't seen this particular use case of fragments. So if you guys already are comfortable with fragments or not too interested about them, you can skip ahead to the next video where we'll actually use the sample application to talk about how fragments and activity bars interact. But for everyone else who just wants maybe a little bit more practice, maybe wants to follow along, see another example of fragments and all that stuff, I guess just you can hang out with me while I put the sample application together. And I'll be sure to point out different things that are important about fragments. There are a couple important points that we can make note of now that we have a better understanding of things like the support libraries. Either way, I don't expect it to take an incredibly long amount of time. So I guess let's go ahead and get started. So I'm on my new project wizard, and I'm going to start off by creating an application, and I'm going to fail miserably at selecting text, apparently, and I'm going to name it. And I'll name it something incredibly uninspired like usual, something like ActionBar Fragments. Sure. All right, let's go ahead and keep our compatibility at 4.2. Compatibility in this particular example doesn't matter, just keep it at whatever. And this time I will go ahead and select blank activity, and I'll hit next, and I'll hit finish. Now, while Gradle does its thing over there on another monitor, let's go ahead and I just want to point out, you'll notice that I created something with the blank activity, with the blank activity template, as opposed to creating the activity myself. And the reason that is ooh, wow, it's done already. That was fast. The reason is now I can actually show you guys what the blank activity template does whenever you tell Android to create or Android Studio to create a blank activity for you, because we've now covered all of those things that it bakes in automatically. So we can take a look at it by opening up our main activity.java file and noticing quite a few familiar things already. You see right here that we extend the action bar activity, which of course comes from the imported support library. We see that we have an onCreate method that sets its content view to activity main, and we see these two familiar methods. Our onCreate options menu, which simply inflates our menu underscore main menu, and our onOptions item selected method, which of course does really nothing, but kind of has a little template-y type thing put together for you to fill in the blanks if you want to. Of course, if you didn't want an options menu, you could delete these methods if you wanted to. Now, the menu itself shouldn't look too terribly intimidating. We have a simple menu XML file with one item defined. The item has an ID of action settings, a title of a string resource to settings, and a shows action set to never. So yeah, not terribly exciting, but none of this stuff should come as a surprise anymore, so yeah. Okay, so for this particular example, like I said before, I'm putting this together in order to show you guys how fragments interact with action bars. So what I need to do is I need to have some sort of application that has one or more fragments that can be shown or hidden. So I think what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put together basically a tab control. A really, really simple, naive, and uninspired tab control, but a tab control nonetheless. Basically, we're going to have two buttons on our main activity. You click 1, fragment 1 appears. You click 2, fragment 1 disappears, and fragment 2 appears. That's basically the functionality that we're shooting for in this video. Now, it won't be particularly robust, and I wouldn't recommend doing this for actual tabs. I would recommend using something like the view pager and other things that we're going to look at in a later video. But this should give you guys some really awesome practice with using fragments that you can apply to other scenarios. But I wanted to keep things simple, straightforward, and familiar, and a sort of tab control is a pretty familiar concept to everyone. So I guess let's go ahead and get started. Before we can actually do anything with our fragments, we have to, well, make them. So let's go ahead and make them. Basically, I'm just going to create two fragments. They're not going to have any functionality in them. They're just going to reference two individual layout files that we'll be able to distinguish from each other. So not terribly interesting. Let's go ahead and right-click on our package, select New Java Class, and I'm going to go ahead and create a Page 1 Fragment class, and hit Enter. I'll remove that awful comment that one of these days I'm going to disable. Okay, so our fragments have to extend a base fragment class, just like our activities have to extend a base activity class. So if I type in capital FRAG, now you'll notice something interesting. What we have here are two fragment classes. We have fragment from the Android.app package, and we have fragment from Android Support v4 app. Now, which one should we use? Now, this is a good question and a really important thing to understand if you're using the app-compat library, or if you have this particular support library imported. Now, just like the ActionBar that was introduced in Honeycomb, Google also introduced the concept of fragments so that we can have better control over individual little semi-functional small activities in our master activities, so that we can rearrange them depending on if we're on a phone or a tablet and reuse them between different screen sizes. So they introduced that in Honeycomb, Android 3, and it was really awesome. So because it was awesome, they were like, it would be really cool if this sort of stuff worked in Android 2, because not many people are using Android 3. So let's go ahead and create a support library for it, just like what we did with action bars, where we have our support library action bar and we have our native API action bar. So they did that with fragments. So that leaves us with two fragment classes, our Android app and our Android Support v4 app. Now, the choice is not arbitrary as to which one to use, and this is just another unfortunate fallout from Google's decision to introduce features in this way and include support libraries that I'm not a particular fan of, but you already knew that if you've been watching this series. Which one do we choose? Well, there's only one scenario in which case the choice is incredibly obvious. Well, there's two scenarios where the choice is incredibly obvious. First scenario is you need to target an Android device before Android 3. If you need to target Android 2, you must use the support library, because there is no built-in fragment support in Android 2. So that makes it easy. If you need to target Android 2, your choice has already been made. The second scenario, which makes things really easy, is if you need to target Android 3 and above, and you need to do nested fragments. If you want that, you have to go with the Android app fragment, because the built-in fragments support the nested fragments, whereas the support fragments do not. So that makes your choice incredibly easy as well. Now, what if neither of these things are true? What if you're supporting Android 3 and up, or 4 and up, and you don't really care about nested fragments? Well, at that point, you have to ask yourself, do I need third-party libraries that may need to depend on fragments? So what I mean is, let's say we have a third-party component that uses some fragment functionality. Now, if it was built against the Android Support v4 fragment, it won't work with any fragments you use in your app if you decide to use the Android.app fragment. So if you have a third-party library that you want to use that'll necessitate using one or the other, then you must choose choose the one that will be compatible. Now, is it possible to run into a scenario where you have one open source or one third-party library that uses one kind of fragment and another third-party library that uses another kind of fragment, and you want to kind of mush them together and put them in your app? Will that happen? It is quite possible that it'll happen. What do you do about it? Well, it depends on the scenario. You'll have to figure that out when you reach that issue. Now, what if that's not the case? Then, basically, I just default to using Android.app. I default to using the native fragment class that comes with the SDK. So, that's what I do. Anyway, I hope that made sense. And again, it's just more fallout from the whole support library fun stuff. That was an awesome idea on Google's part. Okay, so now what do we have? We have a fragment. Now, this isn't going to be an invisible fragment like that just contains data. We talked about that before. This is going to be a fragment that just presents a view. And it's going to be pretty simple at that. So basically, all the logic in this fragment is going to be displaying a layout file, which means we have to override a method. So we're going to override a method that returns a view. The name of this method is going to be called onCreateView. It's going to take out a layout inflator, view group, container, and bundle saved state as parameters. Now, the layout inflator, pretty straightforward. It's the object responsible for inflating our XML files. Our view group, pretty straightforward. It is where this fragment is going to be shoved into on the parent activity. Which view is it going to be shoved into? And then we have our bundle save state, which is also pretty straightforward. It is the same concept as the activities bundle save state. Basically, what it allows you to do is it allows you to shove data into that bundle when your fragment is paused or put in the background or anything like that, and allows you to retrieve that data when the fragment gets recreated or resumed. Or rather recreated. It wouldn't matter if it was resumed. Because if it was resumed, it's still in memory. If your fragment ever goes out of memory and comes back in, then the save state will be important. We don't really care about any of that, though, because we just want to return a view. So I'm going to say return inflator dot inflate. I'm going to pass in a resource file, r dot layout and I'll do a fragment underscore page 1. I am very much aware that this resource file does not exist yet, by the way. We're going to pass in container as the second argument, and we're going to pass in save state as the third argument. Whoops, why did I do that? We're going to pass in false as the third argument. I got carried away there typing out save state all these times. Okay, so we're simply inflating our view and passing it back to whoever invoked on create view. So now let's go ahead and create that view. Fortunately, Android Studio makes that very easy to do. We simply place our keyboard cursor in the middle of this red text and hit Alt-Enter. Now we can select Create Layout Resource File. I'll hit Enter again. And we'll have this pre-filled out new resource file dialog waiting for us. Now the only parameter I'm going to change here is instead of having a root element of a linear layout, I'm going to have a root element of a frame layout. And the reason is because we're not doing any complicated layout-y type things, and the frame layout is really the simplest view group that we can use to compose our fragment. So I'll go ahead and hit OK. Match my properties. I'm going to go ahead and give this frame layout a background. I'll give it a background of, I don't know, CCC. So kind of a light gray. And then inside, I'm going to create a text view with a layout width of wrap content, layout height of wrap content, a text of page 1. Let's change the size, the text size. Let's change that to 28 SP. Sure, why not? And we'll change the layout gravity to center. So remember, the layout gravity is the gravity that determines where this text view appears in its parent. The gravity parameter would have been the way in which the contents of the text view appear within itself. Anyway, that is our fragment page 1 XML file. Pretty straightforward, not all that exciting. So let's go ahead and move on. I want to go ahead and I want to create my page 2 fragment. It's basically going to be the exact same thing as page 1 fragment. So don't mind me, I'm going to kind of go through this a little quick. I'm going to go new Java class, and I'm going to do page 2 fragment. I'm going to go ahead and inherit from fragment, coming from android.app. I'm going to create a public view on create view method, and he's going to take in a layout inflator, a view group container, and a bundle, save state. Then he's simply going to return inflator.inflate, passing in r.layout.fragment underscore page 2, container false. All right, so that's our onCreateView method. Now I'll go ahead and place my keyboard cursor inside of fragment page 2, hit Alt-Enter, and hit Create Layout Resource. For the root element, I'm going to go ahead and show you guys another way that you could have accomplished the same kind of layout that we did in fragment page 1. In our root element isn't necessarily required to be a view group. Now remember, there's two kinds of views. We have normal views like text views, edit boxes, all that fun stuff. And we have view groups, which are used to contain views or other view groups. Now, a root element in a layout there's no requirement that it's a view group. It could be a view if it wants to be. So for example, I could accomplish the same sort of thing that I did in fragment page 1 simply by creating a layout that has a text view as its root element. So now I can go ahead and hit OK. And so now you see I have this text view, instead of a frame layout. And I can make it even more obvious that there's only one thing here, because remember, text view is a view. I can't insert anything in the center here. Any view I try to insert in the center there will throw an error, because a text view can't contain other views. It is a normal view, it isn't a view group. What I can do to make that a little bit more obvious to whoever's reading this code is I can, instead of using this syntax, this XML syntax, I can use a self-closing tag, where I simply introduce a slash up at the top, which just sort of emphasizes the fact that this is a view and not a view group. But anyway, so how would I go about making this text view appear similar to how we have this frame layout in text view? Well, it's pretty straightforward. All I have to do is, first of all, give it a text. And I'm going to give it a text of page 2. Then I'm going to give it a text size of whatever I have over there, 28 SP. So now we have our page 2. Notice how it's at the top left. Now here, I'm going to use gravity. I'm not going to use layout gravity. Why not? Because there's no view group that this text view is a part of. Using layout gravity, using this layout parameter would really be irrelevant in this particular scenario. So I want to use gravity, which, like I said before, the gravity attribute determines how the content within this text view is laid out. So I can say gravity center, and now you see page 2 has now been aligned to the center of the screen, even though the text view is still taking up the entirety of the container. The last thing we're going to do is, instead of having this be a different kind of gray, I'm going to make it a little bit more obvious that this is a different page. I'm going to give it a background of 444, 444, and then I'm going to give it a color, a text color of EEE. So really boring, uninspired gray colors. Maybe we can do 3333333. Make it a little bit darker. Yeah, I like that. Okay, so now we have our fragment 2 page 2. All right, so basically those are our fragments. We have 2 fragments created. We have 2 layout files created. Hope you guys had lots of fun practicing how to put fragments together. It is really convenient to commit this code to memory, memorizing on create view and its signature. It's important so you can bang out fragments really quickly and you don't have to keep on referring to documentation. Okay. So that is our page 1 and page 2 fragment. Let's go ahead and see how we can put them together. Now, before I write any code inside of this Java class, inside of our main activity class, I'm going to go ahead and implement the user interface. So I'm going to jump into activity main, and I'm going to go into text, and I'm going to implement a very naive user interface for this. So it's not going to be very performant. It's not going to minimize the hierarchy. It's going to be a very naive, very straightforward layout. And the reason I'm doing this is in the interest of time. This is not a video about view groups or layouts. There are videos already that you can look up about how to use these different layout groups. Anyway, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change this. Whoa. I'm going to come back. Yeah, there we go. I'm going to change this relative layout to a linear layout. Then I'm going to give it an additional property of orientation vertical. Then I'm going to open up another linear layout inside of it with a layout width of wrap content, a layout height of wrap content, and by wrap content for the layout width, I meant match parent, derp. This guy is going to have an orientation of horizontal. Inside of here, I'm going to have 2 buttons, and they're going to have a layout width of wrap content, a layout height of match parent, a layout width of wrap content, and this guy, the text is going to be page 1. And I'm going to go ahead and give him a layout weight of 1. Then I'm going to create another button with the layout width of wrap content, or I could do 0 dp here. It doesn't matter. And a layout height of match parent, a text of page 2, and a weight of 1. Let's go ahead and give this guy a 0 dp width as well. And now they are evenly spaced. Okay, so what I'm going to go ahead and do now is I'm going to go ahead and do ID. I'm going to give them both an ID. I'm going to give this guy an ID of plus ID / activity main page 1, and I'm going to give this guy an ID of plus / ID activity main page 2, and just leave it at that, I guess. Now, the last thing I'm going to do here inside this linear or inside this layout file is I'm going to go ahead and create a placeholder for where I want my fragments to appear when we click on either page 1 or page 2. So, to do that, I need to create a view group. And the simplest view group I can create is a frame layout. So I'm going to go ahead and create a frame layout with the width of match parent and a height of match parent. And now what you're going to see here is that it's going to fill the entirety of the space remaining inside of my linear layout, as you can see with the blue highlight. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make it a self-closing tag, because I don't want anything to be inside of this frame layout other than fragments. For consistency, I guess I can also give it a margin top of 16 dp. And of course, I'm going to give it an ID. I need to give it an ID so I can reference it inside of my main activity.java file. I'm going to give it an ID of activity main, fragment container. Okay, so let's go ahead and implement our logic here. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the click listeners for my 2 buttons to be routed into the main activity class so that I can handle the click events. So to do that, I'm going to say get view or find view by ID r.id.activity main page 1 dot set on click listener this. Then I'm going to say find view by ID RID activity main page 2 dot set on click listener this. Now, of course, you'll notice this code is being squiglified because the main activity class does not implement the onClickListener interface. To fix that really quickly, I can position my keyboard cursor right here on the this keyword where the squigglies are, hit Alt-Enter, and select the second option, make main activity implement onClickListener. Then I'll hit Enter, and Enter one more time. And I'll go ahead and I'll move this method that it created for me all the way to the top of the file so that we can see both methods at the same time. So now the onClick method is going to be invoked whenever either of the buttons are clicked. So I need to determine which one was clicked. So I'm going to say int view ID equals view. I'll go ahead and change this parameter to view. I hate that it defaults to v. Int view ID equals view.getID. If viewID equals r.id activity main page 2, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say switch page to new page 1 fragment. Else if viewID equals RID page 2, switch page new page 2 fragment. What are you complaining about? Ooh, thank you for that. This one was supposed to be page 1. Activity main page 1, this one was supposed to be activity main page 2. Fortunately, lint caught that error for me, so I'm really excited about that particular tooling feature. Anyway, obviously this code won't compile because we have not yet implemented the switch page method. Now that's going to be a pretty straightforward method, and simply a convenience method that takes in an instance of a fragment and replaces whatever's in our container with that content. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say private void switch page fragment. Then I'm going to say, now I'm going to basically just write the code that will take a fragment object, an instantiated fragment, and replace the contents of a container with that new fragment. Now, how do we do that? I'm going to spell this out line by line. In most examples you're going to see this really long chained method call. But in this case, I'm going to do it line by line so you guys see each part of the operation. How do we introduce a fragment manually at runtime into our container? So the first thing we need to do is we need to get our fragment manager. When I type in fragment manager, of course, making sure to use a capital F so the IntelliSense comes up with the right options, you'll notice again that we have 2 choices. Now, the choice at this point should be fairly obvious. Which one do we want to use? We want to use the fragment manager that comes from the SDK, not the support library. So I'll select this and I'll hit enter. So I'll go ahead and I'll say fragment manager, I'll go ahead and call this manager. And I'm going to say git fragment manager. Now, the reason I'm splitting this out onto its own line is especially so I can tell you guys or show you guys these two methods. These two methods look a little confusing. They look a little confusing because if you look at their return type on the right-hand side, they're both the same class. In reality, they do not return the same class. The git support fragment manager method will return a support fragment manager, whereas a git fragment manager will return a native fragment manager. Since that's the fragment manager we imported, we must use git fragment manager. If we try to use git support fragment manager in this particular code, we will get a compiler error because we'll be trying to set our fragment manager variable to a variable that isn't the same type. In this case, or to a value that isn't the same type. So we must use git fragment manager here. Now we need to open up a fragment transaction. So whenever you manipulate fragments on your activity, you have to open up a fragment transaction. And a fragment transaction encapsulates all of the operations you want to do to your fragments into one object. The reason you do this is so that you can roll back your changes. Meaning, you can take a fragment transaction, you can fill it up with a bunch of potential operations you want to perform, and then you can roll them all back at a later point if you wanted to. For example, if the user hit the back button. Now again, which fragment transaction do you think we need? In this case, it's android.app. So I'm going to say transaction equals manager.begin transaction. Now that we have a transaction, we have to now perform operations on the transaction to describe to Android what we want to do with our fragments. Now, what do we want to do with our fragments? Well, essentially, we want to replace the contents of this fragment container with the contents of whatever fragment we switch to. So to do that, we come back here, and I simply do transaction.replace, an aptly named method, and it's going to ask me for two parameters. First one is going to be a container view ID, and the second one's going to be an instance of a fragment. Well, the container view ID should be pretty straightforward. We do r.id, and in this case, we're doing activity main fragment container, which, if you recall, is the ID of that frame layout that we have in our main activity layout file. The second parameter asks for the instance of a fragment object. Now, in that case, that's provided by the fragment parameter, so I can simply pass in fragment. All right, now we're not quite done yet, and that's because we haven't committed the transaction. So we filled the transaction up with data, we filled it up with instructions on what we want to do, but we haven't told it to go out and actually execute those instructions. To do that, we simply need to do transaction.commit. So by invoking the commit method, it's going to do all the things we told it to do in the previous method calls. All right. Now, we're almost done here. There's one more line of code that I want to introduce into this sample project, and that is, when we start activity main, neither page is going to be displaying. And that should be fairly obvious because our frame layout is blank, and we only switch the fragment, or switch the page, when we click on a button. So when the application launches, the container will be blank. Well, that's really not a common sort of thing to do with tab layouts. Instead, what you would typically want to do is display or have selected the first tab in the tab group. Doing so is really easy with the way that we wrote this code. In fact, I can just come down here to the onCreate method and say switch page new page 1 fragment. And that will default us to looking at the first fragment. All right, let's go ahead and hit run. And we'll see if this code works, which hopefully it does. Otherwise, I'll be very upset. And we're waiting, and we're waiting, and we're using the same device for future launches, and we're waiting. And check that out. So we have our, whoops, come over here. There you go. We have our action bar. We have our settings menu that doesn't do anything. We have our container, which shows page 1 at the moment. And we have our buttons, which switch between page 1 and page 2. So that wraps up a really simple use case for how we can use fragments and how we can manipulate fragments during runtime. So that's a pretty cool, fun little example. And the next video, we're going to see how fragments can interact with the action bar. So we'll see you then.